In 1347, a ship arrived at the port of Messina, Sicily. Its crew was dead or dying, their bodies covered in mysterious black boils. Within 5 years, half of Europe would be dead. The Genoese trading vessels had departed from Caffa, a bustling port city on the Crimean Peninsula, carrying far more than silk and spices from the east. Unknown to anyone aboard, they transported microscopic stowaways, Yersinia pestis bacteria, nestled within the digestive systems of rat fleas. These ships, which had sustained European prosperity through vibrant trade networks connecting east and west, would now deliver apocalyptic devastation to a continent wholly unprepared for biological catastrophe. The scene that greeted Messina's port authorities defied comprehension. Sailors sprawled across the deck, some already rigid in death, others writhing in agony as egg-sized swellings distorted their necks, armpits and groins. These bibus, as medieval physicians would term them, turned from red to purple to black, weeping blood and pus while emitting a stench that witnesses claimed could be smelled from the harbour. The few crew members still capable of speech described a horror that had consumed their companions one by one during the voyage, transforming healthy men into grotesque corpses within days or even hours. Local authorities, operating on medieval understanding of disease transmission, initially attributed the sickness to corrupted air from the ship's hold. They ordered the vessels away from port, but their intervention came too late. The rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes, carrying their infected fleas into the labyrinthine streets of Messina. Within days, the city's residents began displaying symptoms, first a mild fever easily dismissed as common illness, then the telltale swellings that marked certain death. By the time Messina's leaders recognized the catastrophe unfolding, the plague had already begun its inexorable march across Sicily. To understand the plague's devastating impact, we must first comprehend the world it would soon transform. Europe in 1347 stood at the height of medieval civilization, a continent of soaring cathedrals, bustling market towns, and carefully ordered social hierarchies that had evolved over centuries. The population had swelled to approximately 75 million people, the highest level since the fall of Rome, supported by agricultural innovations and climatic conditions that historians now call the medieval warm period. The three-field system had revolutionized agriculture, allowing communities to produce surplus food that supported growing urban populations. Cities like Paris, with nearly 200,000 inhabitants, Florence with 100,000, and London with perhaps 60,000, represented concentrations of humanity unprecedented in medieval times. These urban centres hummed with commercial activity, merchants trading goods from across the known world, craftsmen perfecting their trades within guild structures, scholars debating in newly established universities, and clerics maintaining the spiritual life that provided meaning and structure to medieval existence. Society operated according to the rigid framework of feudalism, a system of mutual obligations binding peasant to lord, lord to king, and all to God through his earthly representative, the church. This elaborate social architecture had evolved over centuries, creating stability through clearly defined roles and expectations. Peasants worked the land, providing agricultural surplus that supported noble warriors who offered military protection, while clergy tended to souls and preserved knowledge. Though harsh by modern standards, this system had proven remarkably resilient, surviving Viking raids, Islamic invasions, and countless local conflicts. The church dominated intellectual and spiritual life, offering explanations for natural phenomena through theological frameworks that placed humanity at the center of divine concern. Disease, according to prevailing medical theory, resulted from humoral imbalances or divine punishment for sin. The dominant medical text, Galen's writings preserved through Islamic scholarship, prescribed treatments based on restoring balance between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians trained in universities like Paris and Bologna combined this classical knowledge with astrological calculations and religious invocations, creating a medical practice that merged science, superstition, and faith. From Messina, the plague spread with terrifying efficiency, following the very trade routes that had brought prosperity to medieval Europe. Ships departing the infected port carried the disease to Catania, Palermo, and across the Mediterranean to North Africa. By January 1348, the plague had established itself in multiple Italian port cities, Genoa, Venice, and Pisa, each becoming a new epicenter of infection that would radiate death across the continent. The speed of transmission bewildered contemporary observers accustomed to the slow pace of medieval life. A Florentine chronicler, Marcione di Copostefani, described the plague's arrival in his city with mounting horror. It began in March and lasted until September. During this time, No bells tolled, no one wept regardless of his loss because everyone expected death. So many died that all believed it was the end of the world. The disease manifested in 3 horrific forms, each with its own pattern of transmission and lethality. The bubonic form, most common and merciful with a mortality rate of merely 60 to 70%, announced itself through the characteristic swellings that gave the Black Death its name. Victims experienced sudden fever, chills and weakness before buboes appeared, growing from the size of an almond to that of an apple within hours. The septicemic variant, occurring when bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, killed within hours as victims' extremities blackened from subcutaneous bleeding, hence Black Death. The pneumonic form, spread through respiratory droplets, proved universally fatal, killing victims within 2 to 3 days as they literally drowned in their own blood. Medieval physicians, working within their understanding of medicine, proposed theories that seem absurd to modern minds but represented serious attempts to comprehend unprecedented catastrophe. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, Europe's most prestigious medical institution, issued a formal report attributing the plague to a malign conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn and Mars that had occurred on March 20, 1345, creating corrupted air that poisoned those who breathed it. This miasma theory led to recommendations that would prove tragically counterproductive, avoiding bathing, gathering in churches for collective prayer, and killing cats and dogs. Venice, that jewel of medieval commerce floating upon its lagoons, demonstrated both the plague's devastating impact and humanity's desperate attempts at containment. The Venetian authorities, more pragmatic than most, instituted history's first organized quarantine system, the word itself deriving from quarantagiorni. The 40 days ships were required to wait before entering port. Yet even this innovation proved insufficient against an enemy that travelled not just with human passengers, but within the very fabric of medieval life, in grain shipments harbouring rats, in clothing harbouring fleas, in the very act of breathing when pneumonic plague took hold. The Venetian government's records, preserved in remarkable detail, chronicle a city's descent into nightmare. By summer 1348, 600 Venetians died daily in a city of perhaps 120,000. The traditional funeral rites that provided comfort and closure became impossible to maintain. The city's gondoliers, pressed into service as corpse collectors, poled through canals calling "Morti, Morti," bring out your dead, while masked gravediggers called bikini demanded extortionate fees to handle the infected corpses. Mass burial pits on the islands of Lazaretto Nuovo and Lazaretto Vecchio received thousands of bodies, stacked like cordwood and covered with quicklime in futile attempts to contain the corruption. Florence, that cradle of the Renaissance still decades in the future, lost perhaps 60% of its population within 6 months. Giovanni Boccaccio, who would immortalize the plague in his Decameron, described a social fabric torn beyond recognition. Brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister left brother, and very often wife abandoned husband. Even worse, and almost unbelievable, fathers and mothers abandoned their children, leaving them unvisited and uncared for, as if they were strangers. The wealthy fled to country estates, hoping rural isolation might protect them. Boccaccio's frame narrative involves such refugees telling stories to pass the time. The poor, trapped in overcrowded urban quarters, died in such numbers that contemporary chroniclers spoke of bodies stacked like lasagna in mass graves. The middle classes, that emerging force of medieval society, saw their carefully accumulated wealth meaningless in the face of death. Notaries grew rich drafting wills until they too succumbed, leaving legal chaos as property claims overlapped and disputed inheritances multiplied. Paris, Europe's intellectual capital with its renowned university and theological schools, experienced not just demographic catastrophe, but a crisis of meaning that shook medieval certainties. The city's careful social order, from the nobility in their fortified hotels, to merchants in their guild halls, to students in their colleges, collapsed within weeks of the plague's arrival in August 1348. The Hôtel Dieu, Paris's principal hospital, became a particular focal point of horror. Designed to accommodate several hundred patients, it soon held thousands, with multiple dying patients sharing single beds while corpses accumulated faster than they could be removed. While cities grabbed chroniclers' attention with their dramatic death tolls and social collapse, the plague's impact on rural areas proved equally catastrophic if less well documented. The peasantry, that foundation upon which medieval society rested, faced the plague without even the limited medical resources available to urban dwellers. Village after village simply ceased to exist, their inhabitants dead or fled, leaving only archaeological evidence of communities that had thrived for centuries. The manor of Wakefield in Yorkshire provides a microcosm of rural devastation through unusually complete records. Court rolls from before the plague show a thriving community of several hundred families engaged in agriculture, small-scale manufacturing and local trade. By 1350, over half the tenanted holdings lay vacant, their occupants dead without heirs. The careful notations of deaths, defaults on rent, and abandoned properties tell individual tragedies in bureaucratic language. John Smith holds 1 messuage and 24 acres of land which came into the Lord's hands through the death of William Smith, who died of the pestilence. Agricultural production collapsed as workers died faster than crops could be harvested. Contemporary accounts describe fields of grain rotting unharvested, vineyards abandoned, livestock wandering untended until they too died of disease or predation. The elaborate system of labour obligations that sustained manorial economy, so many days ploughing the Lord's demesne, so many days harvesting, so many days maintaining roads and buildings, became impossible to maintain as death eliminated both those who owed service and those who supervised it. The psychological impact on survivors defied comprehension. Entire family lines extinguished within days, communities that had existed since before memory vanished, local traditions and accumulated wisdom lost forever. The English chronicler Henry Knighton wrote, "Many villages and hamlets were deserted, no house remaining except perhaps 1 or 2, and in these the inhabitants had died. Some villages were never again inhabited." The Catholic Church, that omnipresent institution that provided medieval Europe with spiritual guidance, social services, and intellectual framework, faced an existential crisis as the plague undermined its fundamental claims. How could a benevolent God permit such suffering? Why did the pious die alongside sinners? Why did prayers, pilgrimages, and penances fail to halt the pestilence? These questions, whispered initially, grew into shouts as the death toll mounted. The clergy's mortality rate exceeded even that of the general population, as priests performing last rites inhaled the infected breath of pneumonic plague victims. The Archbishop of Canterbury died within months of the plague reaching England, followed by his successor, then his successor's successor. 3 archbishops in 2 years. Parish priests, those crucial intermediaries between the divine and mundane, died in such numbers that many communities found themselves without spiritual guidance at the moment of greatest need. The Bishop of Bath and Wells authorized laymen to hear confessions when no priest could be found, a radical departure from established doctrine that demonstrated the Church's desperation. Monastic communities, supposedly protected by their isolation and godly living, suffered catastrophic losses. The monastery of Mowbray in Yorkshire saw 42 of 50 monks die within months. The Abbey of Westminster lost half its brothers. These institutions, repositories of learning, charity, and agricultural innovation, struggled to maintain their basic functions as death eliminated those who knew the liturgy, managed estates, or understood the complex manuscripts in their libraries. The careful succession of knowledge from senior to junior monks, that chain of transmission extending back centuries, broke irreparably in many communities. Popular religious movements arose attempting to placate divine wrath through extraordinary demonstrations of penance. The flagellants, originating in Germany, processed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody while chanting prayers for divine mercy. These groups, initially tolerated by church authorities desperate for any response to the crisis, soon posed their own threat to ecclesiastical order. Claiming direct divine inspiration, they challenged clerical authority, attacked Jewish communities as scapegoats, and spread radical theological ideas that church authorities deemed heretical. As medieval society struggled to comprehend the plague's cause, the human need for explanation and blame fixed upon society's perpetual outsiders, the Jews. Accusations emerged, growing from whispers to roars, that Jews had poisoned wells to destroy Christendom. The libel spread faster than the plague itself, racing along trade routes and communication networks, leaving massacre in its wake. The violence began in southern France, where Jewish communities in Toulon and Apt were exterminated in April 1348, months before the plague even reached those regions. The hysteria spread northward into Germany and Switzerland, where some of history's most horrific anti-Semitic violence occurred. In Strasbourg on February 14, 1349, St. Valentine's Day, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the city's Jewish cemetery, despite the city council's attempts to protect them. The councillors who resisted the mob were deposed, demonstrating how plague panic overwhelmed traditional authority structures. Basil's Jewish community was locked in a wooden building constructed specifically for their murder and burned alive. In Mainz, Jews fought back against their attackers, killing 200 Christians before being overwhelmed and slaughtered. Some Jewish communities, seeing the approaching mob, chose collective suicide rather than face torture and forced conversion. Mothers killed their children before taking their own lives. Rabbis set fire to synagogues with their congregations inside, entire communities choosing death on their own terms rather than at Christian hands. Pope Clement VI, to his credit, issued papal bulls condemning the violence and noting the obvious logical flaw: Jews died from plague at similar rates to Christians. He offered papal protection to Jewish communities, threatening excommunication for those who participated in pogroms. Yet his words carried little weight against popular rage. Local authorities, even when inclined toward protection, found themselves overwhelmed by mobs convinced that eliminating Jews would end the pestilence. The confessions extracted through torture became self-fulfilling prophecies. Jews, broken on the rack or subjected to water torture, confessed to elaborate poisoning conspiracies, providing details their tormentors wanted to hear. These confessions, circulated as evidence, sparked new waves of violence in previously calm regions. The economic dimension, the cancellation of debts owed to Jewish moneylenders through their murder, provided additional incentive for violence, allowing debtors to combine religious zealotry with financial self-interest. The plague's economic impact revolutionized medieval society more thoroughly than any political upheaval or military conquest. The sudden elimination of between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population created economic disruptions that would reshape social structures maintained since Charlemagne's time. Labor, suddenly scarce, became valuable. Land, suddenly abundant, became cheap. The fundamental equations of medieval economy inverted overnight. In England, where relatively complete records allow detailed analysis, agricultural wages doubled, then tripled within years of the plague's passage. Peasants who had previously competed for scraps of land now found lords competing for their labour. The Statute of Labourers, passed by Edward III's Parliament in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict peasant movement, but proved unenforceable against economic reality. Workers simply ignored regulations, moved to wherever wages were highest, and demanded not just money, but better food, clothing, and working conditions. The chronicler Henry Knighton complained bitterly. Such a shortage of workers ensued that the humble turned up their noses at employment, and could scarcely be persuaded to serve the eminent for triple wages. Instead, because of the dearth of servants, churchmen, knights, and other worthies had to thresh their corn, plough the land, and perform every other unskilled task if they were to make their own bread. Urban guilds, those careful regulators of medieval craft production, found their monopolies shattered as desperate need for goods overcame traditional restrictions. Women entered trades previously reserved for men: brewing, metalworking, even construction. Journeymen established independent workshops without completing traditional apprenticeships. The careful hierarchies that had regulated production, quality, and competition for centuries dissolved in the face of overwhelming demand and diminished supply. International trade patterns shifted dramatically as some regions recovered faster than others. Italian city-states, despite suffering enormous losses, leveraged their commercial expertise to dominate recovering trade networks. The Hanseatic League expanded its influence as Baltic regions, less severely affected, provided grain to devastated areas. England's wool trade, backbone of its medieval economy, initially collapsed as Flemish weavers died en masse, then recovered as English entrepreneurs established domestic cloth production, laying foundations for future industrial development. The plague's cultural impact manifested most visibly in the macabre turn of European art. The dance of death became a ubiquitous motif. Skeletal figures leading pope, emperor, merchant, and peasant in democratic procession toward the grave. These images, painted on church walls, carved into wood, and illuminated in manuscripts, served as memento mori, reminders of death's inevitability and life's transience. The democratization of death, the plague's indifference to social station, challenged fundamental assumptions about divine order and earthly hierarchy. The artistic style itself changed, moving from the idealized representations of high medieval art toward unflinching realism. Christ's suffering on the cross became more graphic, saints' martyrdoms more visceral, depictions of hell more elaborate. The peaceful Madonna transformed into the Mater Dolorosa, the sorrowing mother cradling her dead son's broken body. These images reflected a society traumatized by mass death, seeking meaning through identification with divine suffering. Literature too reflected societal transformation. Boccaccio's Decameron, written immediately after Florence's devastation, presented tales of love, lust, and human folly, told by young nobles sheltering from plague. His frank treatment of sexuality and skeptical attitude toward clerical authority would have been unthinkable before the plague shattered social conventions. In England, William Langland's Piers Plowman used allegorical visions to critique social corruption and religious hypocrisy exposed by the plague's trials. The very language evolved as Latin's dominance waned. With educated clergy decimated, vernacular languages gained prominence in literature, law, and administration. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written a generation after the plague, employed Middle English with unprecedented sophistication, creating literature accessible to audiences beyond Latin-educated elite. This linguistic democratization paralleled social changes. As traditional hierarchies weakened and new forms of expression emerged, music transformed from the mathematical complexity of ars antiqua toward the emotional expressiveness of ars nova. Composers like Guillaume de Machaut, himself a plague survivor, created polyphonic works of unprecedented emotional intensity. The Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, became a standard element of the Requiem Mass, its apocalyptic imagery resonating with plague survivors who had witnessed Judgment Day's preview. Medieval medicine, rooted in classical texts and theological assumptions, proved catastrophically inadequate against the plague. Yet the crisis sparked innovations that would eventually revolutionize medical practice. Physicians, desperate to maintain professional credibility while dying alongside their patients, proposed increasingly elaborate theories and treatments that revealed both contemporary knowledge's limitations and human ingenuity when confronting the unknown. The medical faculty of Paris, Europe's premier medical institution, produced a treatise attributing plague to corrupted air caused by planetary conjunctions, earthquakes releasing underground vapors, and even rotting whale carcasses poisoning the atmosphere. Their recommended treatments included bloodletting to restore humoral balance, consuming crushed emeralds, and avoiding foods that supposedly generated excessive heat or moisture. These recommendations, based on Galenic theory refined through centuries of scholarship, proved utterly useless against Yersinia pestis. Some physicians, observing plague's progression more empirically, developed proto-epidemiological insights. The Andalusian physician Ibn Khatima, working in Almeria, noted that plague spread from person to person and recommended isolation of the infected, advice largely ignored but representing genuine scientific observation. Guy de Chauliac, physician to Pope Clement VI, distinguished between bubonic and pneumonic plague forms, noting their different symptoms and transmission patterns. His surgical drainage of buboes occasionally saved patients with localized infections, though he admitted most treatments proved futile. The iconic plague doctor costume, leather gown, wide-brimmed hat, and distinctive beaked mask emerged during later plague outbreaks, but originated from medieval attempts at protection. The beak, stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, supposedly filtered corrupted air, while the leather garments prevented miasmic particles from adhering to the physician's body. Though based on incorrect disease theory, these precautions accidentally provided some protection against flea bites and respiratory droplets. Quarantine, Venice's great innovation, represented the most effective public health measure, though implemented inconsistently and often too late. The 40-day isolation period, chosen for biblical rather than medical reasons, accidentally exceeded plague's incubation period. Cities that rigorously enforced quarantine suffered lower mortality rates, though the economic costs of halting trade made sustained implementation difficult. The plague's demographic catastrophe created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility that challenged feudalism's fundamental premises. Peasants who survived found themselves in extraordinarily advantageous positions. Labor scarcity meant they could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and even freedom from feudal obligations. This economic revolution triggered political upheavals as traditional elites struggled to maintain privileges in a transformed world. The English Rising of 1381, misleadingly called the Peasants' Revolt, demonstrated how profoundly plague had altered social dynamics. The rebels, far from simple agricultural labourers, included prosperous farmers, urban artisans, and even minor clergy groups empowered by post-plague economic changes, but frustrated by attempts to reimpose traditional restrictions. Their demands, abolition of serfdom, standardized land rents, free trade rights, reflected not desperate poverty, but rising expectations among increasingly prosperous lower classes. The revolt's leader, Wat Tyler, articulated revolutionary ideas that would have been inconceivable before the plague demonstrated death's democracy. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, became the rebels' rallying cry, challenging the divine ordination of social hierarchy. The rebels' march on London, their burning of legal documents establishing feudal obligations, their execution of royal officials, demonstrated organized political action rather than mindless violence. Though ultimately suppressed, the revolt achieved its fundamental goals through economic rather than political means. Despite royal proclamations maintaining feudal obligations, labor shortages made enforcement impossible. By 1400, serfdom had effectively disappeared from England, replaced by wage labor and tenant farming. Similar transformations occurred across Europe. The German Peasants' War, the Jacquerie in France, the Ciompi revolt in Florence, each reflecting local conditions but sharing common themes of traditional hierarchies challenged by plague-empowered lower classes. The psychological impact extended beyond economics. Peasants who had watched lords flee estates, priests abandon flocks, and social betters die like anyone else, lost faith in natural superiority claims. The elaborate ideological structures, justifying feudal hierarchy, divine ordination, natural order, protective obligation, crumbled when tested by plague's democratic death. A Bohemian chronicler noted, "The common people now dress like nobles, eat like nobles, and demand to be treated like nobles. The world has turned upside down." The plague struck during the Hundred Years' War's early stages, transforming a dynastic dispute between England and France into an existential struggle for survival amid demographic collapse. Edward III's victory at Crecy in 1346 had demonstrated English military superiority through longbow tactics, but plague's arrival in 1347 made territorial conquest meaningless when there were neither soldiers to hold territory nor populations to exploit it. The Black Prince's devastating chevauchée through southern France in 1355 encountered a landscape already ravaged by disease. Town after town surrendered without resistance, their populations too diminished to maintain defences. The great victory at Poitiers in 1356, where English forces captured French King Jean II, occurred in a kingdom where traditional military service obligations had become impossible to fulfill. French chronicles describe armies melting away as news of plague outbreaks reached soldiers, who abandoned their posts to return home to dying families. Military tactics evolved to accommodate new realities. Smaller professional forces replaced large feudal levies, as population decline made traditional recruitment impossible. Mercenary companies, the free companies that plagued France between campaigns, consisted largely of younger sons who would have inherited nothing before the plague, but now found themselves potential heirs if enough relatives died. These routiers fought for whoever paid best, their loyalty measured in gold rather than feudal obligation. The war's economic dimension transformed completely. England's wool trade with Flanders, which had financed Edward III's campaigns, collapsed as Flemish weavers died en masse. French taxation systems, dependent on stable agricultural production, generated fraction of previous revenues from depopulated provinces. Both kingdoms resorted to currency debasement, triggering inflation that further destabilized societies already reeling from demographic catastrophe. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, temporarily ending hostilities, reflected mutual exhaustion rather than decisive victory. Cities, despite suffering the highest mortality rates, recovered fastest from plague's devastation, their economic opportunities attracting rural survivors and stimulating innovations that would define early modern Europe. Florence, reduced from 100,000 to perhaps 40,000 inhabitants, experienced economic renaissance as surviving merchants consolidated deceased competitors' businesses, creating commercial enterprises of unprecedented scale and sophistication. The Medici Bank, rising from modest origins to European prominence, exemplified this consolidation process. Giovanni de' Medici, establishing his bank in 1397, built upon foundations laid by plague's winnowing of competition. The family's innovative double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and international branch network created financial instruments that facilitated European recovery while generating profits that would fund Renaissance artistic achievements. Archaeological excavations of Medici properties reveal the material culture of this new merchant aristocracy. Imported ceramics, exotic spices, illuminated manuscripts, demonstrating wealth concentration among plague survivors. Urban planning transformed as cities rebuilt with reduced populations. Wide streets replaced medieval alleyways, improving ventilation and reducing disease transmission. Public fountains and washing facilities, previously luxuries, became standard as authorities recognized hygiene's importance. Venice's public health boards, established during plague, became permanent institutions regulating food quality, waste disposal, and building standards. Innovations copied throughout Europe as cities recognized that demographic recovery required active health management. Technological innovation accelerated as labor scarcity incentivized mechanization. Water-powered mills expanded beyond grain processing to power sawmills, fulling mills, and trip hammers for metalworking. The printing press, developed in Mainz around 1450, represented culmination of innovations sparked by plague-induced labor shortages. Gutenberg's combination of movable type, oil-based ink, and mechanical press replaced armies of scribes, democratizing knowledge access while creating new industries. Archaeological evidence from early printing workshops reveals the rapid technological evolution from wooden to metal type, from hand to mechanical inking, from single sheets to bound books occurring within decades rather than centuries. The Church's failure to prevent or explain the plague triggered spiritual crises that would culminate in the Protestant Reformation. Though immediate responses took forms of mysticism, popular devotion, and internal reform rather than institutional challenge. The Via Moderna, emphasizing direct divine experience over scholastic theology, attracted those seeking meaning beyond traditional structures that had proven impotent against plague. Mystics like Julian of Norwich, writing during plague's recurrent outbreaks, described divine visions emphasizing God's love rather than wrath. Her revelations of divine love, recording visions experienced during near-fatal illness in 1373, offered comfort through maternal imagery of Christ and optimistic theology, proclaiming all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, radical optimism given contemporary suffering. These mystical writings, circulated in vernacular rather than Latin, reached audiences beyond clerical elite, democratizing theological discourse. The Devotio Moderna movement, originating in the Low Countries, emphasized personal piety over institutional observance. The Brethren of the Common Life, founded by Gerard Groot during plague's aftermath, created communities pursuing spiritual perfection through simple living, manual labor, and education. Their schools, spreading throughout northern Europe, educated future reformers including Erasmus and Luther. Archaeological excavations of brethren houses reveal austere living conditions contrasting sharply with established monasteries' wealth. Small cells, common refectories, extensive libraries emphasizing practical rather than scholastic texts. Popular religious practices transformed as plague survivors sought more immediate divine connection. The rosary, previously monastic practice, became widespread lay devotion offering structured prayer, accessible to illiterate populations. Corpus Christi processions, displaying consecrated hosts through streets, provided communal religious experience replacing individual confession and communion, often unavailable due to clergy shortages. Books of hours, personal prayer books for wealthy laity, proliferated as survivors invested in spiritual insurance, their illuminated manuscripts preserving both religious sentiment and artistic achievement of plague's aftermath. The Black Death's initial catastrophe represented beginning, not end, of plague's European presence. Recurring outbreaks every 10 to 20 years prevented demographic recovery while maintaining social transformations initiated by the first pandemic. The plague of 1361 to 1362, called the Children's Plague for disproportionately affecting those born since 1348 without acquired immunity, demonstrated the disease's endemic establishment in European populations. These subsequent outbreaks, though less demographically catastrophic, proved socially significant by preventing return to pre-plague conditions. Just as populations began recovering, labor became less scarce, and traditional elites attempted reimposing old obligations. Another outbreak would reset demographic and economic equations. This cyclical pattern, recovery, attempted reaction, plague, transformation, accelerated social changes that might otherwise have required centuries. Cities developed increasingly sophisticated responses to recurring plague. Milan's brutal but effective policy of walling up infected houses with inhabitants inside prevented major outbreaks. Marseille constructed the first permanent plague hospital, the Infirmerie du Lazaret, isolating infected patients while providing medical care. London's Bills of Mortality, begun in 1519, tracked plague deaths by parish, creating epidemiological data that would eventually enable pattern recognition and targeted responses. Archaeological evidence from plague hospitals reveals architectural innovations, isolation wards, ventilation systems, separate facilities for suspected versus confirmed cases, representing empirical learning despite theoretical misunderstanding. Rural areas developed different adaptations. Village communities established warning systems, with church bells ringing distinctive patterns signaling plague's approach. Common fields were reorganized to accommodate reduced populations, with surviving farmers consolidating holdings into more efficient units. Traditional festivals and gatherings adapted to maintain social cohesion while minimizing disease transmission risk. Archaeological surveys reveal settlement pattern changes, dispersed farmsteads replacing clustered villages, defensive sites abandoned for locations with better water access and ventilation. The plague catalyzed technological and scientific developments that would define early modern Europe. Labor scarcity incentivized mechanical innovation, while traditional authorities' failure encouraged empirical observation over received wisdom. These changes, initiated by demographic crisis, created intellectual and practical foundations for scientific revolution. Mechanical clocks, spreading throughout Europe in plague's aftermath, exemplified this technological transformation. Their complex gear mechanisms, precise manufacturing requirements, and mathematical principles represented new approaches to understanding natural phenomena through measurement rather than theological speculation. Clock towers, constructed in cities competing for commercial prominence, provided public timekeeping that regulated urban life with mechanical rather than ecclesiastical rhythm. Archaeological investigations of early clock mechanisms reveal rapid technological evolution, from simple verge escapements to complex astronomical displays occurring within decades as craftsmen competed for innovation. Navigation technology advanced as maritime trade became increasingly important for connecting plague-depleted regions. The magnetic compass, astrolabe, and portolan charts enabled longer voyages with greater certainty, opening Atlantic trade routes that would transform global economy. Portuguese expeditions along African coasts, seeking gold to replace diminished European production and slaves to address labor shortages, initiated explorations culminating in Columbus's voyages. Ship design evolved from medieval cogs to caravels capable of oceanic voyaging, their archaeological remains revealing sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics and structural engineering. Military technology transformed as smaller professional armies replaced massive feudal levies. Gunpowder weapons, previously curiosities, became standard as their expense was offset by reduced manpower requirements. Early cannons, crude but effective against stone fortifications, made traditional castles obsolete. Handheld firearms, though initially inferior to longbows, required less training, enabling rapid army creation from diminished populations. Archaeological evidence from battlefields shows transition from arrowheads and sword fragments to lead bullets and cannonballs, material evidence of warfare's transformation. The demographic revolution initiated by the plague created entirely new social structures that would persist into modernity. The traditional three estates, those who fight, those who pray, and those who work, fragmented into complex hierarchies reflecting economic rather than hereditary status. Successful merchants purchased noble titles and estates, impoverished nobles entered commerce, and prosperous peasants acquired enough land to rival traditional gentry. This social fluidity, unthinkable before plague, became defining characteristic of late medieval society. The emergence of the yeoman class in England exemplified this transformation. These prosperous farmers, owning their land rather than holding it through feudal obligation, accumulated holdings from plague victims and abandoned estates. Archaeological surveys of yeoman farms reveal substantial stone houses, specialized agricultural buildings, and material culture, pewter dishes, glass windows, imported textiles, previously reserved for nobility. Their wills, preserved in unprecedented numbers, document accumulated wealth, multiple properties, cash reserves, investments in trade ventures, provisions for educating children at grammar schools and universities. Urban patricians consolidated economic and political power as traditional nobility's influence waned. In German cities, merchant families formed closed corporations controlling civic government, establishing dynasties that would dominate European finance for centuries. The Fuggers of Augsburg, rising from textile weavers to papal bankers, exemplified this transformation. Their preserved account books reveal international financial networks extending from Lisbon to Moscow, controlling copper mines, financing wars, effectively determining European political outcomes through credit manipulation. Women's social position, though still restricted, improved markedly as labor scarcity created opportunities previously denied. Widows inherited businesses and guild memberships, operating as independent merchants and craftswomen. Female brewers dominated English ale production, their products competing successfully with male-controlled beer brewing. Archaeological evidence from urban workshops reveals women working as silk weavers, gold beaters, manuscript illuminators, skilled trades requiring lengthy training previously exclusive to men. Court records document women conducting international trade, bringing lawsuits, serving as executors of estates, legal capacities reflecting enhanced economic importance. The plague's challenge to medieval medicine catalyzed developments that would eventually produce scientific medicine. Though immediate responses remained rooted in traditional theories, accumulating observations of plague's behavior created empirical foundation for later breakthroughs. Physicians who survived multiple outbreaks developed practical knowledge transcending theoretical frameworks, documenting symptoms, progression patterns, and treatment outcomes with unprecedented detail. Medical education transformed as universities established by plague survivors emphasized practical observation alongside theoretical study. The University of Prague's medical faculty, founded in 1348 during plague's height, required students to observe actual patients rather than merely studying classical texts. Anatomical dissections, previously rare, became standard as authorities recognized need for understanding body's actual structure rather than relying on Galen's animal-based descriptions. Archaeological excavations at medieval medical schools reveal anatomical theatres, preserved surgical instruments, and student notes documenting systematic observation of disease progression. The concept of contagion, revolutionary for its time, emerged from plague observations despite contradicting established miasma theory. Gentile de Foligno, dying of plague in 1348, proposed that disease spread through seeds transmitted between individuals, remarkably close to germ theory despite lacking microscopy to confirm it. His students documented isolation's effectiveness, creating proto-epidemiological studies, tracking plague spread through communities. These observations, though not immediately accepted, planted intellectual seeds that would germinate during Renaissance medical revolution. Hospitals evolved from religious charitable institutions to medical treatment centers. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, rebuilt after plague, incorporated ventilation systems, isolation wards, and specialized areas for different conditions. Archaeological investigations reveal sophisticated water management, fresh water piped to different wards, separate sewage systems preventing cross-contamination, even rudimentary air circulation systems using chimney effects. These architectural innovations, born from plague experience, established principles of hospital design persisting into modern era. The plague generated extraordinary literary flowering as survivors sought meaning through narrative. The trauma's scope demanded new forms of expression, creating vernacular literatures that spoke directly to transformed audiences, rather than through Latin's clerical mediation. These works, preserving plague experience while processing its implications, provide invaluable historical testimony while establishing national literary traditions. Boccaccio's Decameron established the template, frame narrative of plague refugees, telling stories that range from tragedy to comedy, sacred to profane, traditional to revolutionary. His 100 Tales explore every aspect of human nature revealed by crisis, heroism and cowardice, faith and cynicism, love persisting despite death's omnipresence. The work's structure mirrors plague experience, ordered storytelling imposing meaning on chaos, human creativity asserting itself against mortality. Manuscript traditions reveal the work's enormous popularity, hundreds of copies circulated, adapted, translated, demonstrating literature's role in processing collective trauma. The English tradition produced distinct responses. Langland's Piers Plowman used allegorical dream visions to critique post-plague society's moral failures. His narrator's quest for truth through corrupted world reflected survivors' search for meaning amid traditional structures' collapse. The poem's multiple versions, revised over decades, document evolving responses to plague's recurring impacts. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, begun around 1387, presented plague-transformed society through pilgrims whose diverse voices reflected new social mobility, from knight to miller, prioress to wife of Bath, each speaking with unprecedented individuality. The dance of death genre proliferated across Europe, presenting death as democratic leveler, leading all social ranks in final dance. These works, performed as plays, painted on church walls, printed in early books, provided cultural framework for processing mass mortality. The preserved texts reveal sophisticated literary devices, death's sardonic commentary on human pretensions, victims' desperate bargaining, ultimate acceptance of mortality's universality. Archaeological discoveries of Dance of Death frescoes, hidden beneath later paintings, demonstrate the genre's ubiquity and cultural importance. Military revolution accelerated by plague transformed warfare from feudal obligation to professional occupation, from mass levies to specialized units, from chivalric ideals to pragmatic brutality. The demographic crisis made traditional military service impossible, while creating conditions favoring tactical innovation and technological advancement. These changes would culminate in early modern military revolution, but their origins lay in plague's demographic disruption. The free companies terrorizing France between English campaigns exemplified military transformation. These mercenary bands, composed of younger sons, displaced peasants and minor nobles, fought for whoever paid best. Their leaders, like Sir John Hawkwood, accumulated wealth rivaling established nobility. Archaeological evidence from their fortified camps reveals sophisticated military organization, standardized equipment, systematic supply management, even primitive artillery. These proto-professional armies, though widely despised, proved more effective than traditional feudal forces. Swiss military innovation demonstrated how plague-reduced populations could achieve military superiority through tactical discipline rather than numerical advantage. The Swiss pike squares, massed formations of disciplined infantry, destroyed traditional heavy cavalry at battles like Morgarten and Sempak. Their success depended on intensive training creating unit cohesion, impossible with feudal levies serving limited terms. Archaeological evidence from Swiss training grounds reveals systematic preparation, standardized weapons, coordinated drill areas, even early obstacle courses developing physical conditioning. Gunpowder weapons proliferated, as plague made traditional archer training impossible. English longbow superiority depended on lifetime training beginning in childhood, impossible when plague eliminated entire generations. Early firearms, though inferior to bows in range and accuracy, required minimal training. Archaeological evidence from battlefields shows transition from arrowheads to lead bullets occurring within decades rather than centuries. Cannon technology evolved rapidly as siege warfare replaced pitched battles. Plague-depleted garrisons couldn't defend traditional fortifications against artillery bombardment. The plague's impact on Byzantine Empire proved ultimately fatal, weakening Constantinople's defences and enabling Ottoman conquest that ended thousand-year imperial continuity. The empire, already territorially reduced, lost perhaps half its population to plague, including trained administrators, soldiers and craftsmen, essential for maintaining sophisticated governmental machinery. This demographic catastrophe coincided with Ottoman expansion, creating perfect conditions for civilizational collapse. Constantinople's population plummeted from perhaps 400,000 to fewer than 50,000 by 1453. Entire quarters stood abandoned, imperial palaces crumbled from neglect. The sophisticated water system that had sustained the city for millennium fell into disrepair. Archaeological excavations within Constantinople's walls reveal the abandonment's extent. Collapsed buildings never rebuilt, streets buried under accumulated debris, even churches abandoned as congregations disappeared. The city that had preserved classical civilization through dark ages could no longer maintain its own infrastructure. The empire's provincial administration, dependent on educated bureaucracy, collapsed as plague eliminated trained officials faster than replacements could be prepared. Tax collection ceased in many provinces. Military recruitment became impossible. Even basic governmental functions like road maintenance and judicial proceedings stopped. The theme system, Byzantine military organization based on soldier farmers defending their own lands, disintegrated as plague eliminated entire military units. Archaeological surveys in Anatolia reveal abandoned fortifications, depopulated military settlements, agricultural terraces reverting to wilderness. Material evidence of administrative collapse. The final siege of Constantinople in 1453 faced defenders numbering perhaps 7,000 against Ottoman forces exceeding 80,000. Demographic imbalance directly attributable to plague's differential impact. Byzantine appeals for Western assistance failed partly because European powers, themselves recovering from plague, lacked resources for distant expeditions. The city's fall, marked by Constantine XI's death defending the walls, ended classical civilization's direct continuity. Ottoman conquest, facilitated by plague's devastation, transformed Mediterranean balance of power, redirecting European expansion toward Atlantic ventures that would reshape global history. The Black Death stands as history's most consequential pandemic, killing between 75 and 200 million people, while transforming every aspect of European civilization. Its immediate horror: mass graves, abandoned cities, civilizational collapse gave way to profound changes that shaped modernity. The plague broke feudalism's chains, challenged church authority, sparked technological innovation, and created social mobility that enabled Renaissance, Reformation, and eventual Enlightenment. The demographic catastrophe forced innovations in governance, economics, and social organization that created foundations for modern state systems. Centralized bureaucracies replaced feudal hierarchies, professional armies supplanted feudal levies, and mercantile capitalism emerged from manorial economies' ruins. These transformations, born from necessity rather than ideology, proved more revolutionary than any planned reform. Archaeological evidence across Europe reveals this transformation's material reality: abandoned manors, new urban layouts, technological innovations, changing settlement patterns, physical testimony to civilizational rebirth from catastrophic mortality. Cultural achievements flowing from plague's disruption, Renaissance art celebrating human dignity, Reformation challenging religious monopoly, scientific revolution replacing theological speculation with empirical observation, originated in plague's demolition of medieval certainties. Survivors, having witnessed established authorities' impotence against death, questioned traditional hierarchies and sought new explanations for natural phenomena. This intellectual ferment, impossible without plague's disruption, created modern consciousness, emphasizing individual agency over collective obligation. The plague's biological legacy persisted for centuries, through recurring outbreaks that prevented return to pre-plague conditions. Each recurrence reinforced transformations initiated by the first pandemic, labor remaining scarce enough to maintain wages, populations staying low enough to prevent feudalism's reimposition, traditional authorities lacking credibility to restore old orders. These recurring demographic shocks accelerated changes that might otherwise have required millennia, compressing social evolution into centuries. Modern plague research reveals the bacterium's continuing presence in rodent populations worldwide, capable of re-emerging under suitable conditions. Climate change, urbanization, and global transportation networks create conditions potentially favorable for plague's return. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated modern society's vulnerability to infectious disease despite medical advances. The Black Death's history offers crucial lessons. Pandemics transform societies fundamentally, existing authorities often fail catastrophically, and survival requires adaptation rather than attempting to preserve defunct systems. The Black Death ultimately represents both humanity's vulnerability and resilience. A microscopic bacterium carried by fleas on rats brought the mightiest civilization to its knees, killing indiscriminately, respecting neither crown nor mitre. Yet survivors rebuilt, creating from catastrophe's ashes new forms of social organization, cultural expression, and scientific understanding that improved human condition. Their courage confronting incomprehensible horror, their creativity rebuilding from ruins, their determination to find meaning in mass death, inspire across centuries. As we face modern challenges, pandemics, climate change, technological disruption, the Black Death reminds us that catastrophe can catalyze transformation, that established systems can collapse suddenly, and that human adaptability enables survival and eventual triumph. The medieval Europeans who watched their world die could never have imagined the Renaissance, enlightenment, and modernity that would emerge from their suffering. Their legacy teaches that even civilization's darkest hours can birth new dawns, that human creativity flourishes under extreme pressure, and that from death's democracy can emerge life's abundance. The plague ships that arrived at Messina in 1347 carried death beyond imagination, but they also carried seeds of transformation that would bloom into modern world. The Black Death, Europe's darkest hour, became paradoxically the catastrophe that created conditions for humanity's greatest achievements. In confronting mortality's ultimate democracy, medieval Europeans discovered human dignity's universality. In surviving civilization's near collapse, they created foundations for unprecedented progress. In processing unimaginable trauma through art, literature, and faith, they demonstrated creativity's triumph over chaos. This is the Black Death's ultimate legacy, not the millions who died, but the transformed world survivors created. Not the civilization that collapsed, but the new forms of human organization that emerged. Not the darkness that descended upon Europe in 1347, but the light that eventually emerged, the light of Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, and enlightenment. The Black Death teaches that humanity's darkest hours can become transformative crucibles, that catastrophe can catalyze progress, and that from death's universality can emerge life's infinite possibility.